Type 1, Week 5, we scroll down to the In Class tab. Um, you'll be downloading these PDF files. There should be 3 PDFs in this file. One that's going to be a general overview of the typefaces, one that takes a closer look at typefaces, and the last one which goes into small details about combining typefaces. This is the video you're watching right now, so let's begin. Here's the 3 PDF files. We're going to start off with an overview. If you remember, at the beginning of this quarter, we talked about font classifications, and I just wanted to quickly review the different classifications. We had old style, and Garamond's an example where we have the humanist hand, the calligraphic A, that 2-story A, with thick and thin strokes that mirror using a broad nib pen. Then we have the transitional category represented by Baskerville, where the strokes are slightly more precise and a little more thick-thin, and then the stress for that stroke goes from an angle to slightly more upright. Then we've got the modern classification, where you have these extreme thick and thin strokes, and the stress is definitely vertical. The next classification was slab serif, where you have these big chunky serifs, and then this subclass of slab serifs called clarendons, where you had the chunky slabs that had brackets. The next classification was the sans serif, and then we have other classifications that I didn't really go too deeply into, but they're pretty easy to identify. There's the decorative category, there's script, and the final category is black letter. I want to have a small distinction within the old style and sans serif typeface. I mentioned in the previous slide that Garamond was based off of a humanist hand, a calligraphic hand. And what that means is that if you imagine someone with the tool of the broad nib pen, where they're putting pressure down on the page with their downstrokes and the strokes are thick, and then when they traverse the page and go across the page, the strokes become thin, and they have calligraphic features like this 2-story A. It's called a humanist hand, and it replicates where the pen stroke begins and ends on the paper. Well, in sans serif typefaces, there is also humanist letter forms with this 2-story A, as in Gelson's, and it has a slight modulated stroke. You can see it gets a little bit thinner in the joins here, and a little bit thicker in the bowl, and it even has a little bit of a flared terminal stroke that suggests serifs. And you can see Gelson's is based more on the humanist tradition, where there's a greater contrast in the strokes. Whereas Futura is a different class of sans serifs. It's called a geometric sans serif, and it's constructed around basic elements, usually circles or triangles or squares or straight lines. And if you take a look at the strokes, you can see a couple of things. One, they are slightly modulated, a little less so than the humanist strokes. They do taper at the joins, but overall the feel and the look is a relatively even monostroke or mono weight. And also the most distinctive feature is that they are based more off of geometry, in this case the circle, as opposed to the humanist A. And we've got the decorative classification. It's often done for display type, which is type at large sizes, anything over 14 point. And it could be oftentimes other typefaces from different classifications that have been embellished with decorative forms, hence the name decorative typeface. I mentioned slab serifs, these nice chunky serifs right here. Relatively even, uniform weights, very thick, heavy serifs. And then a subclass of sans serifs, slab serifs, where you still have that chunky, nice, thick slab, but the brackets connect the main stem to the serifs. serifs. So what are some of the things you might want to consider when you're thinking globally about choosing typefaces? There's some key things you'd like to consider. The first is readability. How easy and pleasant it is to read a given body of text. And readability can be affected by what you do as a designer when you kern in letter space and you track your words and you do word spacing and leading. You also want to think about legibility when you choose typefaces. And legibility is different from readability. Readability is how easy it is to read, and legibility is how easy it is to recognize or distinguish a specific letter form. So, for example, in some typefaces, this is a letter 1 and this is a letter L, lowercase letter L, and it's illegible as to which is which. And you'd have to spend a little extra time reading through the text to be able to understand what the context is. So it kind of slows down reading because the legibility of the typeface is not that strong. So when you choose a typeface for body text, you really want to be mindful of certain letters that can easily get confused. So P's and Q's, 1's, L's, B's and D's, C's and G's, O's and A's on occasion. The next thing you want to look for are X heights and versus ascender and descender. So ideally, if you're choosing text for a body copy, you want to choose a typeface that has an average X height with a good size ascender and descender. You don't want anything too extreme. You don't want a very large X height and you don't want anything too small. And you don't want short, stubby ascenders and descenders, nor do you want them too dramatic for body text. Now, there are exceptions to the rule. For example, if you're choosing typefaces for early readers, people who are first learning to read, or you are creating documents for people who are above 55 who might need readers, it would be better to choose typefaces that have a slightly larger X height because it's easier for them to distinguish one letter form from the other. This is a nice little aside. If you take a look at these words that have been split in half, these are the top parts of the letters versus the bottom, you'll notice that the letter forms are more legible for both uppercase and lowercase on the top half of those letters as opposed to the bottom. It's very easy to misconstrue which letters these are, but it's less so up here. So when people are reading, they often notice, at least with the Roman alphabet, the top forms of the letters to help distinguish. And lowercase letters are more quickly identified than uppercase letters. What else should you look for? Well, ideally, you should look for a number of type styles. So when you are looking for a typeface family to use, you want to have options. And so you want to look for a typeface family that has a lot of options. Like Accidents Grotesque in this particular typeface family has a lot of options. It's got a lot of type styles. It's got plenty to choose from. So whether my document's 1 page long or 100 pages long, I could design within this one typeface family. I prefer to stay away from a typeface that only has, for example, maybe a regular weight and nothing else. It doesn't have italic, it doesn't have bold, it just has regular. It really limits me as a designer as what I can do with it. So ideally choose a typeface that has a very large family. Here's an example. You can play within that family to create lovely little samples. So this is the same typeface. This is all Garamond. And you can see, you can push and pull the tone while staying within the same typeface family. There's no need to really change typeface families if you've got a family that has sufficient weights and styles. What else should you look for? You should look for glyphs. For example, swash caps or small caps. And that's really dependent on what you're designing. Swash caps are often decorative initial caps that are used for things like book chapter openings or magazines, or the beginnings of paragraphs for longer documents. And small caps are also used for openings of paragraphs for magazines and books. So if you know you're going to be designing something like a long form read, it'd be good to choose a typeface that has small caps and swash caps as options. And glyphs can be found in InDesign under their own glyphs panel. And oftentimes designers will design alternative glyphs for you. The type designer will do that for you. Little aside here. If you're using swash caps, never use them together like this. It looks terrible. They're meant to be used as a point of entry or emphasis in the word. So this is catching your eye and leading you through the word. There are some typefaces that have alternative glyphs for fractions. So if you're doing something like a cookbook or recipes, it would be, or some sort of chemistry book or something that has measurements, it would be really great to use something that has fractions built into the glyphs set. Again, you would do that before you start designing, because gosh, what if you got halfway through the book and you have to go back and redo all your glyphs by hand? It would take you forever. So this is what it looks like is in the glyph panel. And later on this quarter, I can show you how to create your own custom glyph if you do not have them in the glyphs panel available to you. So how do you find alternative glyphs, like alternative swash caps, small caps, fractions? Well, if you go to Window, Type, to Glyphs, you will see the glyphs panel appear, and you'll see certain characters or glyphs have a little black triangle in the corner here. And if you click on that triangle, you'll see the alternative glyph. So this is the regular Q, and there's a swash cap Q and a small caps Q available in this particular typeface. So now, depending on what I'm designing, I know I have options. What else should you look for? This is really important. Old style numerals or lining numerals. Lining numerals or lining numbers look like they're all uppercase, and old style numerals look like they have ascenders and descenders, so they have a little bounce. So these are what lining numerals look like. And sometimes they're called tabular numerals, and the reason why they're called lining numerals or tabular numerals is because they have the same relative set width for all these numbers. And so if you were to line them up, they would form nice columns that you could add from one line to the next. So if you're doing anything that deals with math, you might want to use lining numerals for tabular data. Whereas if you're using information that runs in body text, so for example, if you're doing your address and your business card and you're using a sentence case, capital letters and upper and lowercase letters, or if you're using it within the body text of a work of fiction, you would want to use numerals that have ascenders and descenders so that they flow with the rest of the text and have the same sort of bounce. Here's some right ways and wrong ways to use lining numerals and old style numerals. So you can use lining numerals with all caps, and you can use old style numerals with upper and lower case, and you can use old style numerals with small caps. These samples on the right are incorrect. You do not want to mix and match. They look off. You can see they've been designed so that they fit in terms of the height for when you need to use them. Okay, so now that you have chosen your typeface family you want to work with, how do you combine those typeface classifications? So you can work with harmony and contrast. The easiest way is to choose a single typeface that has multiple styles and weights, like the sample I showed you earlier, the Accidents Grotesque. It had so much to choose from you'd never have to change typeface. Helvetica is a great sample of a very extended typeface family. Or if you want to experiment with mixing and matching typefaces, the second thing you can do, typeface from a different classification, that would really work well if they had the same sort of architectural structure. They would have harmony together. Another way you can combine typefaces is if you look at two typefaces that have almost the same X height. They'd have complementary attributes. Or you can find an extended typeface family that has the same X height and serif and sans serif. So, for example, a designer could design a complete suite of typefaces. Like there's ITC stone serif and ITC stone sans serif, and the same typeface designer designed both, and you could easily combine classifications because the typeface designer already made sure that the architecture of those two typefaces work in harmony together. And then this is from Bringhurst, who wrote The Elements of Typographic Style, which some consider to be one of the Bibles for microtypography. And he says that, or he believes that two typefaces designed by the same designer will have inherent similarity in quality, as well as choosing typefaces from relatively the same era would have a better chance of combining successfully together. So as a review, you could choose a typeface family that is both readable and legible. Choose a typeface family that has expanded type styles and weights. Consider using a typeface family that has alternative glyphs, especially if you have a project that you think would require that. Review the numerals of your desired typeface to make sure you have access to the appropriate glyphs. And this is important. If you're going to do something that's going to be using numbers in it, look for a typeface that has old style numbers or lining numerals. And then start by following the 5 basic approaches to combining typeface and type classifications, which is these 5 right here. In the next segment, I'll be talking a little bit more in detail, getting a little bit of a closer look about how to combine typefaces. I want to go a little closer into some of the things I was discussing from the first PDF about combining typefaces. I mentioned earlier that you want to try to find harmony or contrast. And I said that you could use a single typeface family that has a variety of weights and styles, which this was an example. Or you could have similar attributes where the architectural structure is similar to a different classification or a different typeface that you want to combine together. And those architectural structures, the underlying structures of those two typefaces, have harmony. So here's an example. If you take a look at this body text, it looks rather compressed and upright. It's very vertical, and it really works well with Helvetica because it looks also compressed and upright and vertical. If you take a look at the same heading in Helvetica and you combine it with Garamond, Garamond is a much rounder typeface, and they don't harmonize as well together. It's not that you can't use them, it's just if you do a compare and contrast, it just seems like the first one harmonizes slightly better than the second one because the internal structures are similar. You can see more narrow and upright, more rounded. Okay, the third item is about finding two typefaces that have a similar X height. If you take a look, the heading is Gale Sans, which is a sans serif, and the text is Garamond, and they harmonize fairly well together. They're both humanist, based off of calligraphic hands. So they have a modulated thin, thick stroke and a 2-story A. And if you take a look at the X height, they're relatively similar even though one's a sans serif and one's a serif. And then if you switch it from Gill Sans to Futura, they don't harmonize as well together. First of all, Futura is a geometric sans serif, where Garamond is a humanist serif. So you have a different geometry. These are much more round, and this is a little less so. This is a one-story A with a more monoline stroke, and this is a two-story A with a more modulated stroke. And you can see their X heights are a bit off. The fourth classification, way to combine classifications is using an extended typeface family where the designer designed the same typeface. So this is ITC Stone, which I mentioned before, and ITC Stone Serif. And they harmonize very well together because the same designer designed both to work structurally together. So they solved it for you. Here's some examples. And again, it's more of a compare and contrast, like which looks better to you. And right now, don't worry if you don't see it right away. Right now, we're just trying to sort of open your eye to sort of look at the typefaces, try to look at the structures. What do you notice? Are they upright? Are they narrow? Are they geometric? Are they wide? Do they have long ascenders and descenders, large X heights? And then just compare and contrast and see which one you think work better. Those are two. And here's a little trick that designers use. If you are unsure how well the two typefaces from two different classifications go together, you can do one of two things. The more buffer space you add between the heads or the subheads and the body text, the more they seem to go together. Or if you add a little more contrast to your heading by increasing its weight from, say, a regular to a bold, then that contrast, that differentiation, will make it harmonize better with the body text, even if it's not as good a choice as a different choice combination you could have made. So adding a little distance or adding a little weight would help. In the next PDF file, I'm going to go over little subtle details. And this is the final PDF. This PDF file goes into combining typefaces. And one of the most important things when you think about combining typefaces is that ideally, when you combine typefaces, it should be from two separate classifications. Whenever possible, try to choose a serif and a sans serif, or a script and a sans serif, or maybe a slab serif and a sans serif, so that you're pulling the combinations from two different classifications. That way, you'll have a better chance of making it work. This last PDF shows a series of different tweaks and changes you can make to create more harmony between typefaces as you combine them together. So here we go. The first sample here is harmony combining fonts from the same typeface family. This, I mentioned before, is the easiest way to combine typefaces because the typeface designer created lots of different weights and styles for you to work with. So this is Bauer, Bodoni, Roman, black, and italic, and they just naturally go together. And this is ITC Stone, Sans, and Serif, and they naturally go together. Here's an area where you can build in contrast, where you combine typefaces with notably different letter forms. So you're choosing two different typeface classifications, and you want to emphasize the contrast while unifying the design. So here they're using Walton Bold and Kunstler Script Black. And you can see right here they're, yes, from two different typefaces, but they just feel a little bit off. One of the things you can do is take a look at and I analyze why do they feel off. And for me, it's mostly a weight issue. If you take a look at the S and the C, from the thin to the thick strokes, they feel much heavier and more dominant than this more delicate script that has a more dramatic or higher contrast thick to thin stroke. So you can take this V and scale it up until this thin stroke is very close to this thick stroke, and until their thick stroke or downstrokes are pretty similar to the downstrokes of the serif typeface, and you'll see that they harmonize much better. And then the second thing you can look at when you look at this combination is, going back to our letter spacing exercises, is the weirdness of the letter space between this inclined stroke and this curve versus what's happening here with the SV, which is much tighter. So when you increase the scale of that V and you look at the spaces and alignments, they're much more even throughout, and so you end up with something that has a lot more harmony. So not only can you choose from two different typeface classifications, you then observe what other tools do you have in your tool belt to work with, and in this case it's weight and scale to make them harmonize really well. Another strategy for combining typefaces is making the X heights similar. So if you can see, we have two typeface choices, two different classifications. We have a serif and a sans serif. And when we make them have the same relative X height, they harmonize much better than when they're their same point size. So this is technically the same point size, but this X height is dominating and the weight is dominating this type. But when you change the type sizes so that the X heights are relative to each other, it has more harmony. This last sample is pretty funny. We've got two very expressive, strong personality typefaces, and when they're at the same size, they are competing in hierarchy. They're both yelling, "Pay attention to me first." And as a designer, you want to help people access the information. And so playing with hierarchy by reducing the scale of one and letting it take the second tier within the hierarchy and letting the other be more expressive in the hierarchy is very helpful. So here in the Casual Friday barbecue, they're both relatively the same size, and then you downplay Casual Friday and it feels like it harmonizes better. It's not great, but it harmonizes better. The final thing I want to say that I see happening often is students combining two typefaces from the same classification. And it's not that you can't do it. I've seen some successful combining. But you really have to be mindful and look at those letter strokes and architecture and terminals and stroke weights really, really with a fine-tooth comb to be able to see if they truly go together. And here's an example of three sans serif typefaces that on first look, if you're a novice, you might think go together, but if you study them, there's some really strong things that don't work between each letter. They kind of butt heads. And so if you take a look, this first letter is very boxy, while this is very round. This is very sharp. So you've got three different shapes. You've got rectangles, triangles, and circles. You've got terminal strokes that are flat here and angled here. You've got apertures that are really small. The openings are very small here, and you've got very open apertures. So there's a lot of variation happening between these three. And so it would be better if you're choosing something that looks very similar to each other to just use the same typeface. It would avoid a lot of problems. Or if you want to create emphasis in this trio of letters, maybe choose a completely different typeface classification to make one of those letters stand out. Okay, again, if you have any questions, I'm available after this lecture series. You can hop back into Zoom and we can answer any questions you might have.